It's Saturday, the day after the worst day of our lives. 6 days ago, we were with Jesus as he rode into Jerusalem. It was an occasion filled with such expectation, and we had no real premonition of the awful events of this past week, all culminating in the horrific crucifixion of Jesus. We cannot begin to describe our shock. Here we are, huddled together, quietly, trying to keep a low profile because we are still frightened, but also trying to process what happened over the last 36 hours or so. We're hoping that we might experience some comfort in our mutual grieving. There's no question of trying to make sense of what has happened. It is a total, unmitigated disaster. It's too early to try to work out what we will do with our lives now. We are just too numbed by grief and sorrow. Today is a strange day. We have no desire to do anything, no desire to go anywhere. There's a spirit of listlessness in the air. We are thoroughly depressed and miserable. The reality of what has happened is still sinking in as we mope together. It's the end of our hoping for and dreaming of a different world. Aspects of the truth of what happened yesterday are difficult to comprehend. Jesus carrying his cross on the path to Golgotha, the weeping women surrounding him, his words suggesting that they should weep for themselves and their children and not for him. Did he mean that their suffering would be worse than his? That something terrible, bringing death and destruction, was going to happen to them? And Peter, he was so full of himself at dinner last night, and he always wants to be the one to profess undying love towards Jesus and the one who declares that he will be absolutely loyal to Jesus no matter what. We notice that he hasn't got much to say for himself today. As for Judas, we had always had our suspicions regarding his motives, and we wondered whether we could really trust him. But what he ended up doing sends shivers down our spines. Is he pleased with himself now that Jesus is dead? At least the women stayed at the cross, and John was there. It was good that Jesus asked John to look after his mother. Jesus and John had always been very close, which sometimes wasn't that easy for us to accept. How Mary coped with the whole traumatic experience of yesterday, we'll never know. At times, though, during the last 3 years, she thought that Jesus was overdoing it in terms of caring for people, and he wasn't having regular meals and maybe wasn't having enough sleep, and she became really concerned about his health and the fact that he was neglecting himself. And also she was obviously really worried about some of the contentious things that Jesus said. I guess she wanted him to toe the line a bit more so that people would like him and not turn hostile. Then there was a sudden strange darkness yesterday, and we heard that the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. It seemed as though God was doing that in anger because of how his son was being treated. Maybe God was fed up with the priests because they were complicit in this crime. Maybe God was fed up with the whole system of worship with its emphasis on ritual and sacrifice and so much pretense and superficiality. It is shocking, though, to think of the most holy place behind the altar, behind that curtain, normally hidden away from ordinary people. It's shocking to think that the curtain was torn in two and that was exposed. The curtain was ripped and everybody could see beyond that curtain into the most holy place. What does this all mean? Of course, Jesus seemed to have an idea that all of this was going to happen. He probably didn't know exactly how everything was going to pan out, but he certainly sensed trouble, and he didn't shy away from it. But we can't make any sense of it. Was this really necessary? If Jesus had played his cards carefully, he could still be alive. Then he would have been able to help a lot more people. It doesn't make sense. Didn't he think of this? So many people need God's intervention, and now Jesus is gone. We were surprised too that Jesus never seemed to be afraid. Of course, in the garden, he was terribly upset. He was really hoping that there would be a way of avoiding this. But once he was convinced that he had to go through with it, he had an iron will. There was nothing that could hold him back. It was incredible to hear that Roman centurion acknowledge that Jesus was someone special, divine. Before that, the soldiers rolled dice for Jesus' clothes. They were all blissfully unaware of the fact that an innocent man was dying. Well, what would they care anyway? It's typical. Most people will grab anything for free at the expense of others. And most people are happy to kick a man when he's down. Certainly that's what the soldiers were doing. Laughing and fooling around and gambling while Jesus was suffering and struggling even to breathe. As you can gather, we're thoroughly disillusioned. That criminal next to Jesus wanted Jesus to save his skin, but he was guilty. We heard that he had murdered people. At least the other criminals seemed to realize that Jesus was not just an ordinary man, and he seemed to believe that Jesus could promise him new life after death in paradise. And Jesus was prepared to do that in the midst of his pain. To think that Jesus asked God to forgive the very soldiers who were nailing him to the cross. How do you do that in the midst of terrible pain? We remember that Jesus taught us to love our enemies, but it's not easy for us to do that. It doesn't really make sense, because if we love people who are treating us badly, then they'll laugh at us even more. Jesus said that those soldiers didn't understand what they were doing, but it was obvious that they were getting pleasure from their victim's misfortune and the pain that they were inflicting. They at least knew that, and surely that makes them responsible for what they were doing. And what about our leaders? Ruthlessly trying to keep law and order, but ready to sacrifice Jesus for the sake of their own reputation and ambition. Were they really feeling threatened? Of course, Jesus was really popular, but he was hardly a political or a military threat. Right up until the last minute, we thought God might have had a plan. How we would have loved it if angels had swooped down, swept in, and lifted Jesus off the cross. That would have shown them who was really in charge. But of course, nothing like that happened. When it came to the crunch, it seemed like God had no power or no desire to save Jesus. Is that why Jesus cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Did God abandon Jesus? That's a raw deal. You do everything you can to please God, and then he pushes off right when you need most his help and his presence and his comfort and his reassurance. It is surprising, though, that Jesus still seemed to believe. As he was about to die, he said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." He was still calling God Father, and he seemed to entrust his spirit into God's care, whatever that means. And now he's dead, defeated. What he stood for is a lost cause. What do we do now? We can't really continue to do the work that he started. We feel defeated, weak, afraid. We can't do it on our own. If that's what happens to people who stand for love and truth and justice, then we're not sold on the idea of continuing. But how can we go back to our dull lives? Before we met Jesus, it all seems as though life was so dull then. We were lifted out of that. And now to go back to our former lives as though nothing had really happened in between, I don't know that we can do it. We have been changed. Some of the things that Jesus said and did have rubbed off on us, and we are beginning to change, I think, in our attitude even towards each other. Maybe we're not pushing and shoving quite as much as before. But now Jesus has gone. He's died and he's been buried, and maybe we've been duped. Maybe it is all about power and money, and maybe it is about looking after number one, because if we don't look after ourselves, no one else will. Maybe we just have to toe the line and obey orders and let things carry on as they were. It's a tough life and it's a dangerous world. Maybe the best way to handle it is to keep your mouth shut and do nothing to upset the apple cart. And even as I say this, I'm conscious of the fact that it can never be the same. We can't just merge in with the rest of the people and think like they think and do what they do. We can't do that. And everything that Jesus has poured into us over the last 3 years is deeply ingrained in our hearts and in our heads. Enough of this rambling. Jesus is dead. Nothing seems to matter anymore. His body is sealed in a tomb. It's a torn body which is now cold and already disintegrating. I guess we'll come to terms with this. I hope that we'll find something meaningful, something absorbing to do with the rest of our lives. Oh God, you know our emptiness. You know the depths of our depression. You know how gloomy we feel. You know how lost we feel. You know that life doesn't seem to have any purpose anymore. We don't know where to turn to. We don't know where to go. We don't know what to do. We don't know what to hope for. God, can you maybe turn things around somehow?